You know, your podcast is called A Modern Sage,
Mhm.
and that's so beautiful. So to become a sage, what are your images of spirit,
Right.
of the divine? And often these images are hidden in the shadow. People don't take them out and look at them. Oh, I don't believe that anymore. I don't want to imagine that.
Connie, I couldn't be happier to have you on the show. You have been such a prominent and important writer, figure, leader, teacher, and inspiration to so many people in the realm of psychology and mindfulness and spirituality. And before we get started, I just want to say that's one of my favorite things about you is the combination of the mindfulness and the psychology, or the spirituality and psychology, because there seems to be a wide divide in a lot of people's practices. So thank you for bringing that.
Thanks for observing that. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So you have a new book out, which I want to dive into today, and also honor your past work. A lot of people know you from some of your previous books that have been well received in psychology, but also in the world of spirituality. A lot of people now talk about shadow work as part of their growth, their personal growth, and initiation into their maturity, if you will. So your new book is all about aging and becoming, or coming into the, out of the role and into the soul, as your subtitle suggests. So tell us about your current work and why you decided to write this important piece.
Okay, thank you so much. So my earlier books, Meeting the Shadow and Romancing the Shadow, explored a method of how to work with our unconscious material. Often we only experience that when it kind of erupts and sabotages us. And I call that part that sabotages us a shadow character.
Mm-hmm.
And teach people how to personify it, how to give it a name and an image, so that it kind of emerges from the amorphous unconscious into a figure that they can relate to. In order to be able to relate to it, I suggest that we have a spiritual practice, as you were saying, because if we're grounded in some kind of a centering practice, and I don't really advocate mindfulness, I really teach all kinds of meditation and allow people to follow their own intuition about that. But as long as we have some kind of a centering practice for quieting the mind, then we have a refuge inside to return to when we meet the shadow. And we have an easier way to get space from it when it erupts. It can be very disruptive.
Yes. And I want to talk about that a little bit, and also then how it relates into a person maturing into their later years, because I think that shadow part comes out screaming sometimes in a dire effort to correct time, if you will. So if someone has a sense of their shadow side, I guess what I hear you saying is that if they are grounded in their own practice of groundedness, awareness, and an ability to calm or quiet the mind, then they have more capability, bandwidth to observe their shadow without becoming ungrounded and becoming reactionary and maybe in conflict with the shadow.
You know, often when one of these parts of us erupts, let's say it's the critic or the foodie or the couch potato or the angry one or envy or whatever it is, it throws us off balance. It kind of overshadows the mind, and we end up feeling like that's who we are.
Mm-hmm.
And so we feel shame and we feel lost. When we have a spiritual practice, we have more spaciousness inside the mind to be able to say, oh, there's the foodie. Do I want to eat this chocolate now, or I want to make a different choice?
Right.
And before that moment, we were just acting out the shadow behavior unconsciously. So when we learn how to bring consciousness into the process and have a relationship with this previously unconscious figure, then we have more choice, more freedom. So what happens as we move through the lifespan and we live in this ageist culture is we've internalized ageism for decades, maybe some of us from childhood. I know I did. And we end up feeling badly about ourselves as we get wrinkles, as we slow down, as we maybe become forgetful, as we face retirement, whatever our issues are of aging, as we face loss. And so we want to uncover the unconscious fears and beliefs about aging that are in the shadow in order to age more consciously and more joyfully. So in our culture, and so I call that character the inner ageist. Okay. So the inner ageist carries in most of us the part of us that worships youth and doesn't want to grow old.
Yes. And I agree. I think this starts so young. I remember when I was a little girl looking to my grandmother, who I thought was so beautiful and so together. And I loved looking at her hands and the veins and her jewelry. And I just found her to be incredibly beautiful. But in my mind, she was 55 at the time. I remember having the first conscious awareness of what a grandmother is. And a grandmother is 55. And, you know, I'm approaching 55 now, and I think you've already gone through 55, if I could be so bold to say that. Yeah. But this idea, the stigma that comes with, you know, well, just how we identify with ourselves. And like you said, and there's certain identifications we've come to regard as good or bad or shameful. And I guess it brings me to the question of where did we learn these? Where did we learn this? I know the media plays a big part, but even before that, where does the shadow come from? Where do we learn to become so judgmental of self in relation to the other?
Well, there are a number of sources. The media is one of them. And I know when I was growing up, the television shows like All in the Family, where, you know, Archie Bunker was just contemptuous of his wife. And she was kind of portrayed to be kind of a nitwit. So, you know, those messages affect us as kids, whether they're in the schools, in the movies, or in our own families. So, for example, I didn't have a positive image of an elder like you did, not one. So I didn't have a model to internalize, oh, wow, look at all the possibilities for late life. This is fabulous. I look forward to it. I didn't have that. And so we don't have a way, and in our culture, we don't have elders. We don't speak about elders with reverence. And, you know, we have age segregation in housing. We have arguments about resources between young and old people. And so there's a sense of, even when we're young, we're unconsciously internalizing this message that young is good, bad is old. And not only that, strong is good, weak is old. Independent is good, dependent is bad. Strong is good, weak is bad. Quick is good, slow is bad. Yeah. If you start to look at these dichotomies in the culture and the way that we kind of value traits, you realize a lot of it is about age. So then what happens? We start to slow down. We start to become a bit dependent. We start to become physically more weak. And I had so many clients, older adults, who felt terrible about themselves, even self-hate, because this was happening and they hadn't resolved early emotional issues. And so those started coming back again as these changes, these natural changes of age were occurring.
It's it's really so unfortunate. I mean, I know I don't need to tell you that, but it's this natural and beautiful cycle that we are in, and not just as humans, all living beings, of birth and death and the experience between those two endpoints. There couldn't be anything more natural than that.
Right.
And how we have perpetuated subconsciously, and a lot of people even consciously. I work with a lot of clients still, and for women in particular between the ages of 40 and 50, that wouldn't be all I work with, but for those people, there's a huge concern, especially if they're single. They're never going to find love, they're not going to be chosen, they're not going to be attractive anymore. And even before that, I hear people in their 30s talking about getting old. And, we all have this language that perpetuates this problem. But I would say, and I'm not a historian by any stretch, that prior to media and maybe prior to the Industrial Revolution, I don't know what the age period was, and still in some cultures, age is revered, correct? There was a time when we looked to our elders for wisdom, for guidance, to cherish and support them. I don't know when. Maybe you can.
Well, the indigenous cultures in our own country had a different relationship to their elders, and they had rites of passage. And one of the things I tried to do with the new book, The Inner Work of Age, is build it as a rite of passage. Mm-hmm. So it's filled with practices that you go through step by step. You learn how to do a life review and really track what happened in your personal story. And then the shadow dimension of the life review, or your unlived life. Mm-hmm. And you learn how to connect what was expressed with what was repressed, and how to reframe certain events, and how to reconcile with relationships. So the life review leads naturally to emotional repair. Because you want to give and receive forgiveness when you begin to recall events and relationships. So there's that part of becoming an elder. And then there's creative repair, all those creative dreams and aspirations that we left unexpressed and unfulfilled. We have time now with our longevity to begin to explore some of that. And there are so many people who are picking up painting and musical instruments and composing and all kinds of things. And then learning how to do spiritual repair, which is examining what your spiritual beliefs are now, especially in the context of impending death. So for people in their later years, what are your beliefs? Do they really match who you've become over all this time? Mm-hmm. And what are your images of the divine? Your podcast is called A Modern Sage, and that's so beautiful. So to become a sage, what are your images of spirit, of the divine? And often these images are hidden in the shadow. People don't take them out and look at them. Oh, I don't believe that anymore. I don't want to imagine that. I had this client who was practicing Buddhism for years. But when we dug down and explored his images of the divine, his Catholic childhood was there with this Pope-like figure sending him to hell for his sexual fantasies. Wow. So how do we kind of uncover our spiritual images of the divine now? And then how do we find a practice? Mm-hmm. How do we find a contemplative practice that really fits who we are now? And for me, that's about becoming a sage. Yes. That's about becoming an elder. Well, I think you just answered the question I was going to ask, is what makes a person go from being an older person to an elder person? And I think that you find parts of what that is that comes from your book. Yeah. We all become seniors on our Medicare birthday. Mm-hmm. But what does that mean? It's chronological. Mm-hmm. It's not developmental or psychological. It doesn't mean we've done the inner work of age to become an elder, because we've all seen older adults who are lost in the past and reminiscing, who are rigid and bitter. Right. So yes, they're seniors. They've had the privilege of living long, but they haven't done the inner work of age to become a sage or an elder.
Yeah.
And that takes practice and guidance. And I think there are a lot of people now, 10,000 people retire every day in our country. There are a lot of people who are disoriented, looking for guidance about this. And the subtitle, Shifting from Role to Soul, came from Ram Dass, a spiritual teacher, Ram Dass.
I love him.
And I think it describes exactly when we retire, we lose our work roles.
Mm-hmm.
And some of us lose our family roles as well at a certain stage. And so who am I?
Mm-hmm.
That spiritual question comes around again, just like it did at midlife.
Right.
So who am I if I'm not the therapist, if I'm not the CEO or the mom? Who am I now?
Right.
And so I give a lot of practices to explore that shift from our roles to our deeper spiritual identity. Whatever we call that, and it doesn't matter to me, if you're a Christian or a Buddhist or Jewish or whatever, you have your own language for that, that's fine.
Yeah.
But the internal shift in awareness is what I'm interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And then bringing that quality of awareness, we could call it an elder's awareness, into whatever we do, whatever contribution we're making.
Yeah. Well, for those who are listening and haven't quite captured the full title, Connie's book is The Inner Work of Age, Shifting from Role to Soul. And there's amazing reviews, and it just came out, I think, last fall in 2021, correct?
Yeah, September.
Connie, your work previously, and I'm sure, it's continued into this work, dealing with the shadow and so forth, is very, very much based in Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud. And as I said, you're one of the pioneers who brought that information to light in a big way for people, writing not only just books, but you've been a clinician, a therapist for many years, and your work is just enlightening. When I think of this collective shadow and the collective paradigm that we're all living in, the programming that we're under, in particular with the topic of aging, or so many other topics as well, particularly now, how do we, I know it starts on an individual basis, but what can we do as a society, as a community, as a family unit, to try to shift the whole language around aging and becoming an elder versus what I feel is like empowering the elder instead of disempowering the self. Yeah, and it's just such a wide divide there. What can we do?
Well, I suggest that we first do our own work,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so, for example, during retirement, the shadow character is called the doer.
Mm.
And if we are deeply identified with the doer and our success and our achievement and our product, or as you mentioned, our self-image, for some people, that's more important,
Mm-hmm.
Then we're going to have a crisis when the doer begins to shift, because we're going to start feeling useless, invisible, irrelevant, and all those early psychological injuries are going to surface again. So my sense is that for us to contribute to the collective shift, which is happening around ageism, we need to be sure that we've done our own work. And I don't mean to become perfect and complete everything. I just mean that we have enough inner awareness of our own shadows. We have enough connection to our own spirit or soul or pure awareness, whatever we call that, that when we take social action, let's say in the social justice movement for age, which is happening right now, or the anti-ageism movement, as it's called, then we bring with it our own self-awareness.
Mm-hmm.
Because if not, we bring to it anger and moral outrage and all the stuff that we brought to politics in our early years, in our heroic years.
Right.
And that's not what the culture needs now. we have enough polarization and anger and reactivity in our country. So, my suggestion is that we do the inner work and then we listen. What calls to us?
Mm-hmm.
What is the contribution that only you can make?
Mm.
What is the gift that only you can give? And what will you regret if you don't give it now?
Mm-hmm.
And then when you get some clarity of that, some purpose, some calling, begin to look for all these elder groups that are happening now. Elders Action Network, the Third Act, Saging International. There are these communities of elders that are gathering now just for what you're describing, just to become purposeful and make contributions to the collective.
Yes, that's beautiful. And I always think too of, doing our own personal work, how much it affects anyone and everyone, not just those in our immediate family, and our grandchildren and their friends and so forth, but everyone we interact with, how we hold ourselves, present ourselves, feel about ourselves, the energy we emanate as a person, as a being, is so impactful. And I think that can have tremendous impact on, like for example, my grandmother, and of course, right. I've gone through stages where I felt old or don't want to get old. I've come to a place in the last 10 years where I love aging. I just love it. It's so freeing.
It's very freeing.
Yes. But, I certainly understand, and I see it day to day. We see it every day and how people are interacting with each other. I'm interested if you take us back a little bit more into, for those that maybe haven't done shadow work or don't understand the shadow, not just in relation to ageism, but for these other characters that are formed in our shadow self. Where does that begin? What happens in the psyche or in one's person? Is it all in the developmental years when we start to establish who we are and judging ourselves and other people causing pain within us?
Yeah, the shadow forms really early in our lives when we're in our families of origin. And we're told, or not even with words, with gestures and looks, glances, this is okay, this is not okay. Mm-hmm. This is terrible, right? This is bad. This is approved, this is forbidden. And so what happens is the qualities or traits or behaviors that are rewarded mm-hmm. and approved of and result in love go into our conscious personality, our egos. Oh, daddy wants me to be happy. Okay, I'm going to be happy. It's not a conscious process. It's how the ego develops, the conscious personality develops. So the opposite goes into the shadow. If he wants me to be happy, then he doesn't want me to be sad. So I'm not going to show my sadness today. And those feelings of sorrow or grief or disappointment get buried in the unconscious. And this habit is built as the ego and the shadow develop in tandem. And that's kind of a simplification, but that is how it works with the personal unconscious, not with the collective that you were talking about, but with the personal unconscious. That is how it works. And so then we're in school. And the kids will praise athletic gifts, but maybe they'll mock academic gifts. Oh gosh, he got A's again. Look at him, that nerd.
Right.
So then what happens is you start to develop certain feelings about being smart or intelligent and other feelings about being athletic. And certain gifts get lost in the shadow. So it's not just carrying, quote, negative traits. If your artistic gifts are seen as a waste of time in your family, you're not going to cultivate them. And you may have been a really good artist, but you're not encouraged to do that. So those gifts get left in the shadow.
What about when you mentioned earlier about these characters that you've given names, like the couch potato, or I was reading another article of yours talking about one of your clients who was propelled to cheat on her husband, even though what she wanted more than anything was to have a loving, caring relationship, which was happening in that marriage, or the eater, the person who has the eater character. How does it become so specifically identified as this kind of persona or behavior that nudges at us when we get triggered and wants to act out?
Well, the method is, I'll do it as briefly as I can.
Yeah.
Let's say the foodie is coming up and she wants to eat ice cream again, and she's been eating ice cream every night at bedtime. Now it's coming up again. So first, she starts to notice, what is she saying to herself with that impulse? Because there's a repeating inner dialogue that happens every time that particular shadow figure comes around. There's also feelings that go with that inner dialogue, and there's bodily sensations that go with it. Those three dimensions are repeating. They're not the same if the couch potato is coming up or the critic's coming up or some other character. They're the same when the foodie is coming up and driving her to eat ice cream.
Okay.
So she starts to recognize those three dimensions that the shadow character is coming up. She personifies them as the foodie, gives it a name. Some people give it an image. So let's say the foodie is a big open mouth. Then she has a moment when she can stop and say to herself, this is the foodie. This is the shadow figure driving me to eat the ice cream. I have a moment in which to be conscious of that and make a different choice.
Right.
Okay, the same thing can happen with issues around aging in my new book.
Yeah.
So this is the doer. I'm tired today. I really am feeling like I want to focus on my self-care. But the doer comes up. I'm not worth anything if I don't get this done. That's the internal message. If I don't get this done today, I'm old and I'm worthless. And people will notice and they won't, I won't look good to them. And so you start to get the inner dialogue of the doer that's keeping you in a heroic midlife hurried pace. And not allowing you to slow down, to self-reflect and do the inner work and become an elder.
So I can see where that would create so many things. One being a lack of peace and contentment just with oneself. I guess even further, I don't mean to wear this out, but what's curious to me is we have the developmental years where the shadow is developing, according to, as you said, the glances and the gestures and the what's okay and not okay about who we are. But what makes it a specific kind of character? Like perhaps I might not have a foodie, but my friend has a foodie character. Maybe my shadow character is, obsessively washing the dishes or something like that. What creates the different aspects of each person's character, and why that? Because I think so many people feel like they have something wrong with them if they have this foodie character, or if they have this, constant urge that's different than other people in their family or their friend unit. So I'm curious what makes those specific ones develop.
Well, that's a deep psychological question that I think is, depends on each person's individual psychology. So for some people, they're multi-generational shadow figures. So one woman I worked with, when she uncovered her foodie, she realized that her mother did the same thing every time her father, the husband, went out at night. She would eat. And so she saw this behavior modeled in order to manage anxiety, and she unconsciously picked it up.
Wow.
So that's one explanation. Yeah. But, there are many, I think for each of us, our psychology is shaped in different containers with different people, different adult caregivers, and different, like for example, my 10-year-old grandson is in a household that's full of anxiety and chaos. There's a lot of chaos. And he's anxious now, 10 years old. He's a little sponge. He's just picking it up in the atmosphere, and I can see it now.
Right.
So sometimes what I try to do with him when I'm not in a doing mode, and often I am, we'll play handball or we'll go for a walk or something. But sometimes I just sit next to him and calm my own nervous system. And then I can feel him calming down.
Yeah.
Because he's absorbing that instead.
Right.
And that feels to me, like you said, we affect everybody by just who we are. And that feels to me like it's not doing, but it's being a gift for him. And just sharing the calm and the peace of mind. And he settles down, and I can feel it right away. So there are different ways that people's psychologies are shaped in the family. Some of it's obvious, some of it's not so obvious. And there are different ways of forming protections or defenses against that. And each of the shadow characters forms as a defense originally. So first it protects us, and then as we grow up, it sabotages us, right? So, originally you might use the food to calm yourself down, but then eventually you're overweight and you're using it to deal with anxiety, and it's no longer productive.
Right. Yeah, it makes total sense. Well, I'd love to hear from my guests a little bit of personal information. You mentioned your grandson, I know, and I love to hear those stories. But as an expert in your field and now the author of this new book, The Inner Work of Age, I'd love to hear your personal challenges of aging and the beautiful aspects that you've come to in your own personal journey. If you could just give us an example, because you're human, even though, you have a lot of wisdom around all this, you're human. So what can you share with us that either before you wrote the book or as you were, moving and shifting into this new time of your life, what was challenging for you?
Well, that's a great question. I'm practicing the shift from role to soul. So for me, I'm practicing that internal shift in awareness while I'm really busy with the book, because I'm doing a lot of events, a lot of teaching, and much more than I expected. And so I'm not slowing down. And yet, even though I've retired from clinical work, and yet I'm practicing this shift. I am not the doer.
Yeah.
Right? I am pure awareness. And as I expand into that more and more, and it settles in, and I'm embodying it more and more, what I'm noticing is that I'm less attached to the outcome of all my doing. I'm more open to kind of the flow of time. My relationship to time is changing. I'm watching the sunset every day. That's a new practice for me because we moved recently, we downsized, and we're on the water.
Nice.
And so I'm watching the sun go down every day. And so, and my husband is ill. My husband is ill. And so that's changing a lot of how I spend my time and how I feel about the limited time we have left.
Right. I'm sure. Yeah. Sorry to hear about your husband.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing part of your personal journey. I think it's really important for people to be able to relate. When you talk about the doer, I very much relate to that because I am, maybe some would say an extreme doer. I feel like I produce a lot, and I'm in the activity and I love it though. I love the doing. So what do you say to someone who is recognizing the part of the doer who is engaged and fulfilled and satisfied in their work and their connections and so forth? And also maybe there's an unhealthy part of their doerness, their doer being that is too much. Is there kind of a fine line there, or because I don't want to have people believe it's not okay to do, but what you're saying is that doer that's trying to override the sense of beingness and the acceptance of the new role or the shift to soul, right?
Yeah, it's about where we place our identity.
Right.
So in our culture, everybody's unconsciously identified with the doer.
Right.
That's what we value. That's what we reward.
Right.
Right? Whatever the doing is, whether it's the laundry or building a company or teaching high school, the doing is what's rewarded. And so we learn that very young. And what my message is, independent of what we do or don't do, independent of how much we volunteer or don't volunteer, how much we do our creative projects or don't do our creative projects, there's a possibility here for a spiritual shift in identity, independent of our doing, because I'm doing a lot.
Yes.
But if we pick up a spiritual practice, if we do some of the practices that are in the book, we can begin to move our identity from that compulsive doer into a more expanded awareness, a spiritual identity that actually connects us to everyone and everything, a transpersonal center, whatever we call it.
Yeah.
And that shift from role to soul changes how we do what we do, because we experience it differently. And many people don't stop doing.
Right.
Some people will stop doing in the sense of become more introverted or more contemplative. And that happened to a lot of people in the pandemic. But there was no guidance for how to use this time to turn within, right? Which is really a shame, because in that way, the pandemic was a profound opportunity for many of us.
Yes.
And it was liminal. It was undefined. Like, we're not going to go back to what it was. And we don't know what's on the other end of it. And that's a lot like late life.
Right. You're right.
We're not going to go back, and there's no normal. There's just this uncertainty and a kind of limbo. And, what my book does is it really helps you explore what this liminality or this limbo is about by asking the question, who am I? And picking up the practices that will help you to answer that and emerge from the other side of it with elder awareness or connection to soul.
This sounds like a book that is not only helpful for people entering in their later years of life, but for any person. I'm curious, what age group are you seeing that's maybe surprising you, that's taking interest in the book?
Well, I had intended it for people 50 plus, but someone just told me he's 30 years old and it's changed his life because he feels totally differently now about aging.
Wow.
So I was thrilled about that.
Yes.
Yeah. So I don't think it's age restricted. It's really a matter of interest.
Yeah. To that point, I know that there is a definite shift in our experience of beingness. And as you said, a lot of people identify that as soon as they become a senior citizen. But the truth is we're always on the journey to becoming the wiser version of ourselves, hopefully, if we're in the spiritual practice. And it has nothing to do with a linear sense of age. It has to do with one's own journey and where they are and their interest in stepping into that position with a greater awareness and acceptance. And I'm so thankful for you and your work. And
thank you.
I really am. I feel honored to have you and have a conversation with you today. And I hope that your book, will have the links in the notes underneath the podcast. I hope your book reaches far and wide and supports you, in your later years, both financially and in your heart.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I just am really grateful for for what you've contributed. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
It's reaching people. It's
Yeah.
really reaching people, and I'm feeling a profound fulfillment and gratitude.
Yeah. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Good for you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Connie, so much. And to all else, we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Bye.